welcome.
Thank
How's it going?
Good. Really happy to be here.
Happy to have you here. And I think we pick up the idea with the green and red cards. That's something we have to be spontaneous, because we will be talking about cities, right? And we will be talking about architecture and mobility systems. So on the one hand side, there's everything on the built environment, right? Our construction, and then we have our mobility systems. We would like to learn from you, what do you think has the bigger CO2 impact? Our construction sectors, the built environment, that would be the green card, or mobility, that would be the red card. You also want to give it a try, and let's see. Construction is green, mobility is red. Pretty clear.
Yeah.
Is that right? What do you think?
That's about right. Yeah, that's very right. The built environment, so construction is accountable for about 40% of energy-related emissions, carbon emissions. And that's also because of all the materials that goes into making buildings. So that's the embodied carbon. But then there's all the operating. So all the energy that's used to actually have a building function throughout its entire life. So that's buildings, there's infrastructure. It's a lot. So it's more than mobility. Sometimes we talk a lot about, not flying. Not that we should fly less, agreed. But the building sector is really one where we really need to do a lot there, because the impact can be so much greater, about double in terms of emissions with the mobility sector.
But that's interesting. Let's dive deeper into this. So what's then the role of architecture in that sustainable transformation? You said the impact can be much higher. However, a long way to go also to redesign the things that we have built already out there. So what's the role of architecture then really?
So very important role. I think that in general, the built environment is something that touches us all. Only way to not be involved with the built environment would be to live under a rock. It's impossible. No matter where you're born or where you live in the world, you always interact with the built environment. So it's something that shapes the way that we are, our society, all the things that we're able to do. It's what makes cities vibrant. It's what makes things come together. So the built environment is a very important part of our lives, and therefore creating a built environment that's sustainable, that's inclusive, has a huge impact on our society and on the planet, so on our well-being, etc.
But also there, in two dimensions, we see a lot of cities being now designed from scratch somewhere around the world. Something's happening at the outskirts of cities, but we're also dealing with existing infrastructure, right? How do we then rethink existing systems? It's not an easy thing.
No, it's not. And I think that in 2040, about 2/3 of the building stock will be existing, the buildings that we'll really need. So we need to use existing buildings like these and refurbish them. And of course, we want to build less if we can. That's the first step, not build a really nice eco building. I think the first step is just not to build one at all if you can. So it's all about reusing what's already there, taking the existing urban fabric and injecting different things there to be able to create something that's much more adapted to today's world, and also that addresses, of course, the climate crisis, because lots of the buildings were built in a different time and did not necessarily take into consideration all the things that we need to today. So it's all about using that, going from there, and starting with what's already existing. And I think that goes for everything, but especially, yes, with the built environment.
But then there's multiple dimensions as well. On the one hand, the long time frame, as you mentioned, right? We're talking about also decades where things will be renewed. So how do we deal with that in the meantime? But also when you think of architecture and the world of architecture, that's quite fragmented. Maybe you need to get us a little bit into this. There's so many different players involved in so many different stages. Where are the big levers then for this transformation also in this world?
So the building sector is a very fragmented sector. It's one that's made up with a lot of SMEs, and it's a lot of different stakeholders. You have developers, you have investors, you have designers, engineers, you have the people who will live there, the people who will work there, etc. And we tend to work in silos, and I think that goes for other industries as well, but particularly in the built environment, it's a big problem, because to be able to have any kind of solution, you need to collaborate, you need to come together, so you need to break down some of those barriers. Yep. And that's really where it starts. So seeing the perspectives of different stakeholders within the process, seeing the perspectives of some that have always kind of been left aside. And I think nowadays we're starting to see a lot more inclusion of citizen participation, citizen advocacy groups, people participating in creating the city that they want, or that we all deserve, a better, more inclusive, regenerative city. And that's a really important part of the process. So being much more inclusive in who gets a say, who's involved, what type of decision makers are we having. We talked about diversity earlier in the panel and in the keynote. So having different team members who are going to look at things from different perspectives is a really important part that is not yet, we're not there yet. I think architecture is a very exclusive and a very elitist profession. A lot of, the education system, it takes a long time to be able to call yourself an architect. It's a protected title. So you have to do a number of years of studying, etc., which is important. I think it's important that we safeguard that in a way. But I call myself an archivist, which is the delightful blend of architect and activist. And I want that to be much more inclusive. So while architect is a title that's protected and for a select few, I invite you to embrace archivism and to think of yourself as an archivist. Anyone who is a part of creating cities, creating built environment, it can just be in putting plants outside of your house to make your neighborhood a bit nicer. It can be going to town hall meetings. It can be doing all sorts of different activities at a smaller level, at a citizen level, but it can also be in a professional aspect of working within the built environment to do with materials or to do with processes. But I think that we can kind of come together. We talked about earlier a bit, sometimes we feel that we're all working on things from different angles and it can feel a bit separate. But we're not working in silos, and I like to think of archivism as a way to bring us together in one movement. I think we need that a bit to feel empowered to create change.
Because I think what's fundamentally important is, and that's where we already start to open up, it just goes way beyond the pure building itself, which is already complex, right? But we're talking about just cities. I mean, there's something in there. It's not only the environmental point of view, but also a societal point of view that is fundamentally important. So the rearrangement or the arrangement of buildings and all these built environment elements also have a huge implication on how we live, and maybe secondly, then also on mobility. I think that's an important aspect, right, and an important link.
Absolutely, they're very much linked. If you create, we just heard it, if you create a city for cars, then you'll get a city for cars. You're not going to get something else. And so it goes, the way to get out of this is to think about different uses. We know that shared streets, one of the really nice things that's come out of it is, of course, less emissions. But I think beyond that, it really allows for a myriad of uses. And so it's about being more diverse in the types of things that people can do there, or what sort of things can happen, who can find their place. And that really comes from the fact that our cities have been historically designed by and for what I call reference man, who's your 1.80 meter, white, cisgender, heterosexual, upper middle class white man. And it's very exclusive. Thinking about our cities in this way completely disregards women, children, the elderly, LGBTQ plus people with disabilities, people with who are more neurodiverse. I mean, the list goes on. So I think that starting to think beyond reference man is a very important way to get started with how we can create more just and equitable cities.
And not just reference man, I mean, even there, one step back, we have a lot of cities that have been very much designed with a car-centristic focus. I mean, maybe in the US even worse than in Europe. Is that also something that's fundamentally changing? Because we had the discussion also before. Then the discussion, of course, on reference man. So they, on the one hand side, need to be more human-centric, right? This is what I hear out of it. But maybe we even need to go one step beyond that.
Yeah, well, reference man, the streetscapes are based around reference man's lifestyle. So reference man has a 9 to 5, he goes to work, he comes back in time to kiss his kids goodnight, and dinner is served by the Mrs. Reference man. And this is how we've built our city. So the car-centric model is a reference man model. It's built around this narrative, which is getting more and more outdated and just not reflective of the society that we live in today. And that's what creates these cities that are completely exclusive. We talk about mobility, we think of I think Katja Deal just mentioned it with the pink tax or trip chaining that women tend to do. We know that if we look at disaggregated, gender disaggregated data, first of all, women spend a lot less time commuting by car, and they tend to use public transport and other forms of transport, walking, cycling, etc. And mainly this is because of the caring aspect of that. Our women tend to, because of the societal norms that we have today, it's not biological or something, it's about the fact that women tend to take up these caring aspects. So when you're using public transport, you might be there with a stroller, and then you have to take, your daughter or your son to the doctor, and then you have to take them to daycare, and then you have to go to work. And all of these ways of using public transport are not integrated sometimes in the way that the transport systems are put together. They're thought about this 9 to 5, this rush hour moment, which is really, that's when people use mobility systems the most. But that's when reference man does, but not when a lot of other people do, taking their parents, for example, to the eye doctor or whatnot. There's all sorts of other uses. And I think that when you start to look at different people, so non-reference men, you start to see the different opportunities also that there are to serve underserved and marginalized groups, which can also be a great business opportunity in a sense, to tap into untapped markets and serve a group that is ready to use whatever service would be available, but doesn't have access to it at that moment.
But I mean, there's one thing also. Yesterday we talked about redesigning. Remember when we had a panel on circular economy, we need to redesign product services early on. We're still dealing with old mechanisms here, kind of the same. So we're dealing with systems that have been designed maybe from a wrong perspective, maybe pretty biased. You mentioned our reference man, but still, how do we overcome that bias that early on in the design process of whatever we do, not just architecture, mobility, we have this broader view on things? How do we make that happen?
I think the first step is recognizing that we are all biased. I think sometimes we tend to think, no, I'm not, and I'm able to see these things, and I'm not biased. And maybe I can mention a riddle, which is that there's a father and a son who are in a car accident. And it's a tragic car accident. The father is killed on impact, and the son is in critical condition, and he's wheeled to the hospital, wheeled into the operating room, and the surgeon comes in and says, oh, I can't operate on this child because he's my son. How is that? I think when I heard this the first time, I thought, how is that possible? Some people think the father that died, maybe he was a priest, maybe that type of father. I'm in a same-sex marriage, so I thought, oh, the surgeon is the other dad. And I was like very proud of myself about that.
Maybe the doctor was on drugs. I don't know, I'm confused, but I also saw some confused people here in the audience, right? What do you guys think about? So how does that make sense?
Exactly. Surgeon is the mother.
Surgeon is the mother, yeah.
And a lot of us don't come to that conclusion quickly at all. It's incredible. It's really not, you don't have to search very far. You have a mother, father, okay. It's quite simple to get there, but we don't do it. And it's because we have these ingrained biases, and it's very hard to shake them. So I think that the first thing is to understand that we are all biased, and not to pretend or try to think, well, I'm not, I'm beyond that. We're not. Doesn't matter what you look like, doesn't matter who you are. I mean, I'm far from being reference man. I'm not white. I'm in a same-sex marriage. I'm a woman. I'm 1.50 meters. I'm really not reference man, but I still couldn't get this right. So I think it's important to recognize that, and to then use that as a way to create more diverse teams, to try to speak to other people, think of different perspectives, and also make sure that in these teams we're not looking only at what we can see as a difference, because sometimes we think Okay, this person has a different skin tone, so then like, that checks all the boxes. But there's also other things. Sometimes we are in groups where we're all from the same socioeconomic background, regardless of the color of our skin or of our gender. And that is already a certain privilege, I think, that Katja mentioned, that sometimes we're completely not thinking about other income groups who just cannot access the same education and therefore cannot be in the same spaces at all. So it's really important to seek out different groups and to be active about it. You can't, inclusion happens by design or it doesn't happen at all. It's not something that can just kind of happen by accident.
Maybe a little anecdote that just comes to my mind. We had a 5-day workshop on digital product design for elderly. So we were at a university in Switzerland. And on the first day, the students were like, no, we hate that. Can't we design a music app? And they're like, really, why are we supposed to do this? So we forced them to think into elderly. After 5 days, this was really a transformation in their mindset going on. So they were all like, oh, let's design an app for grandpa, how he can order pizza and so on. But it's really still very, very tricky to get that first crack into that thinking. This is where I'm still want to also dive a little bit deeper. How do we make that happen? I think also your example now with the riddle was a good one, because these are the little triggers where you start thinking differently, right? With this wow, aha moment.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also recognizing that we can't design for all at the same time. So I think we talk a lot about designing for everyone, and then you just design for no one, because it's impossible to design for every single different person. I mean, we're like 8 billion on the planet. You cannot design something where every single person will feel wonderful in there. That's just not how it works. But so singling out, I think being a bit more specific, designing this app for grandpa, looking at this particular case, can then open up something. Maybe this app is also great for someone who has who's more neurodiverse as well. And so it's not only for grandpa, but it then is useful for someone else. But I think when you start to look at it from what grandpa needs, then you're already very specific, and then you start to find that other people can find their place. There's one for cities, a nice way is thinking about if you're elderly, so 80 plus, let's say, and your children can find happiness in this design, so really sort of two different groups, then a lot of people in between can as well. Of course, it's not a foolproof, or it doesn't work for everything, but I think singling out things, designing for very specific things, can lead to nice spaces where other people who weren't the intended user find happiness. So, and I think that in the end, we all have different affinities, different things we're interested in. So as different groups to look at specific target groups, in the end, we get a eclectic and diverse city based with people designing specific things for, in a way, specific groups. But it becomes a place where you find your way in the eclectic city that comes of it. But when you design for everyone, then
doesn't work.
It really doesn't work. And I think it's important to highlight it, because we talk a lot about, yes, for all, and we need to change that notion of what that means and be a bit more specific. Otherwise, we end up with what we already have, designing for reference man, who's supposed to represent us all, but represents no one here.
We are in the future designing a little bit more for reference grandpa as a new category. But I think what's also important is, Nyasha, to learn from these good examples that are inspirational out there. Architecture can be also quite emotional, right? I mean, there are great buildings out there. We just showcased the Eiffel Tower again. Somebody came up with this idea that is kind of triggering people. Where do we see these good examples that people resonate with, where we say, this is a good one?
Yeah, it depends on the theme, let's say. But I think there's so many buildings that are that help with our well-being or help with our health, or cities that are doing a lot. I mean, Buenos Aires, in terms of mobility, has been doing a lot to pedestrianize, to create much more inclusive, working with communities, to rechange this car-centric way of having cities. Same with Brussels, for example. There's the iconic image of the Grand Place, where they had all cars just parked there, which I think for now it's mind-blowing to think it was a car park. I mean, a nice square with beautiful buildings. But now it's, of course, pedestrianized, and Brussels was a very kind of car-centric, ugly, from lots of people think city, but they're really working hard to change that. There's so many nice examples. I think in architecture, there's a nice example of gender-neutral bathrooms that are made initially to help with transgender people who were being assaulted in bathrooms. You know, people were thinking, why are you here? You shouldn't be here. So unsafe spaces for people. And in the end, the design led to stalls that are for big people, small people, tall, short, places for people to pray, for example, to wash off. I have twin daughters, and when you go to the bathroom with a buggy and 2 kids, there's not a lot of room. So just redesigning this bathroom and thinking more about different types of bodies or different types of uses all came from initially thinking about how we could make bathrooms more accessible to transgender people. And in the end, it creates something that's, that you can find your place with low sinks, high sinks, and everyone kind of finds a different spot. And so I think the value of inclusive design is that by being a bit narrow at the beginning, you start to create different opportunities for a larger group.
Yeah, super interesting. And maybe also to link it a little bit to yesterday, we had one really good speech about the role of education, and maybe then aspects like diversity, equity, inclusion need to be much more incorporated early on in education, because then you start thinking differently. It's also a way to go here.
Absolutely. I think that education is really a nice moment where you can do so much, and you can do things that you know aren't happening fast enough in practice. If it reminds me, if I think back to my own upbringing, let's say, I know that my mother was very adamant about us having books with people who looked like us, or girls who were Black who were doing great things, so that then you could also see yourself and see role models and see things that you weren't necessarily seeing in the classroom or in other spaces. And I think that education is the same way. You can create, if it's not happening in practice, if it's not happening in the business sector, if it's not happening in the actual professions yet, as an educator, I think it's a great opportunity to be able to show what can be, to really get students, to see things that they won't be exposed to later, to have that critical way of seeing things and questioning things, so that then when they arrive in a world that is already set up with things that are shifting at a slower pace, they're well equipped to start challenging the status quo, asking the right questions, saying, how come this is the way that it is? Why does it have to be this way? It doesn't. How can we change it? So education plays a crucial role, and it needs to be more accessible. Like I said, a lot of things, especially architecture, but other professions, tend to be elitist. So just the people who are already there and who are admitted to the schools, especially international students who tend to pay more than local students, it tends to be higher income students. So that's already another issue, that then the body of students is not as diverse in terms of socioeconomic background as it really should be in this particular profession, but I think in lots as well, yeah.
Thank you very much, Nyasha. And I think everybody in the room now says goodbye to reference man. So let's say goodbye.
Ditch him. Just get rid of him.
Ditch reference man. Thank you very much. Big applause for sharing all your insights. That was fun speaking with you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.